Yeah, it's pretty exciting. We're only 2 days in, and we're already 20% pledged. But you have to keep in mind that the first day is always the best, right? And
Okay.
once people sort of get used to the idea, yeah, it's there. It gets harder to find the specific people that are left who haven't pledged already. So it's absolutely very positive. But I know that there's still a lot of work to be done to make sure we hit our goal.
What do you do to get that going? I mean, do you already have an audience for Amazing Stories
Well,
going into the
amazing.
Kickstarter?
Yes, Amazing Stories has been a website for 5 or 6 years now. It was mostly nonfiction. It was mostly reviews and analysis of modern and classic science fiction. So we had a mailing list of about 20,000 people on that.
Oh,
So that got us started. All of us who are involved in it are also involved in different science fiction communities. So we all have, the people we can go to let them know and also to have them spread the word.
gotcha. And now Amazing Stories is going to go more into the speculative fiction market and publish authors that are writing science fiction.
That was always the goal when Steve Davidson got the name, I think almost 10 years ago now. His plan was always to revive the magazine as a fiction magazine. Various financial and other situations put it off for a while, but when I came on and we started talking about it, it seemed like something that was finally doable, and so now we're finally making the push to kind of fulfill his dream, if you will.
So, is there what made it now more of a possibility?
There are financial considerations. I can only briefly talk about one. You may have heard that there is a plan to revive the Amazing Stories TV program. And if that does come to pass, we will have some financial benefit from that. And so that was a major impetus. That was like, okay, we can now afford to have a first issue. And with the Kickstarter, we could then afford, hopefully, if it goes well, to have an entire first year. So that was a large part of the impetus, I will admit.
So, you are a well-known satirist in the science fiction market yourself.
I wouldn't say well known, but I have a bit of a following, yes.
Why do you why satirist? Why satire as a genre?
Well, so when people a lot of artists when they're young they have like what I call conversion experiences. They have this kind of aha moment
Hmm.
that I want to do this for the rest of my life, right?
Yeah.
And when I was an undergraduate, I took a lot of film courses. I knew a lot of film students. And it was the kind of experience where, they get a film camera when they're like 6, and making films is all they ever want to do for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
So for me, the experience was when I was 8 years old, I decided that I wanted to write comedy, right? And I have to explain this because I've been writing science fiction for maybe a decade now. Uh,
Hmm.
but I was a comedy writer long before I was a science fiction writer, and comedy is what my conversion experience was about, right? When I was a kid, so after I had that experience, the first thing I did was I wrote parodies of Sherlock Holmes stories because that's what I was writing at the time. My dad, who's an accountant, gave me the paper. I had these legal-sized accounting sheets that I had to use the back of because the front just had too many lines and I couldn't do them. I couldn't write on it legibly. And I remember, although unfortunately these are lost to time now, but I remember that I wrote one story per page. And I thought, first, hey, it's fun, it's great, I want to keep doing this. But the second thing I thought of was, well, how do writers actually come up with enough to fill like entire stories? That to me was kind of a mystery. But then, so at the moment I have 7 collections of short stories and 5 novels out. So I guess I must have figured something out, right?
Right. I'm looking at what Welcome to the Multiverse,
Yep,
which is
that's my first novel.
that was your first novel.
Yep.
Wow, how did that feel to produce? And you're published through Elsewhen Press.
Yep. I'm Canadian. Elsewhen Press is British. Most of our sales are in the United States. Go figure, right? Um,
Quite international.
I'll tell you. So I was quite happy writing short stories. I didn't really have any burning ambition to write a novel. But then I heard about this writing contest, right? It was for first novelists, and it was for specifically humorous science fiction. And it was uh, one of the judges and one of the people who was most promoting it was Terry Pratchett.
Wow.
And I thought, this is an opportunity that I absolutely cannot pass up. The only problem with entering a first novel writing contest is, of course, you have to write a novel.
Yeah.
So that's, that was the impetus for it. Now, I didn't get anywhere with the contest, but so now I've got this novel, and it's like, what do I do with it? Well, I sent it to a couple of publishers who weren't interested, and then I heard about Elsewhen Press, probably I think on Twitter, and I sent it. I sent them a query letter. Would you be interested in this? What I got back from the publisher was, oh, okay. I've done a little research on you, kind of looked for you on the net, seen what you do. You seem entirely crazy.
That's a great response from a publisher.
Just the kind of person we want. Send us the first 3 chapters, and it went from there.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah,
So I
it's been
mean,
a lovely relationship. He's published all 5 of my novels to date. And I mean, I do stuff like I change up fonts a lot. In the second novel, there are like 11 different fonts. And as we were editing through the first book, and I said, there's okay. In the first novel, there is a scene where 2 characters are having dinner, and they're kind of attracted to each other, and you don't know if they're going to have sex or not after the dinner. And punctuating the scene are a series of baseball line scores, where it's the abstinence angels versus the sexy devils or something, and each time one moves in one or the other direction, one of the teams scores points, right? And it was kind of a weird thing to have in a novel. And as we were editing the first novel, I said, I'm sorry if some of it seems really out there and crazy. And the publisher was like, oh, no, no, no. We want to make sure that we get this exactly right. If we can make it even more crazy, we're good with that. And it's like, I have found a home.
who writes like you? Are you 100% unique in terms of the stylization that you're using, or are you kind of borrowing your inspiration from another author or authors?
Um, Certainly in science fiction, I'm unique. I often in reviews get compared to Douglas Adams.
Yeah.
And while that's
So you,
flattering, because I'm a huge fan of Douglas Adams too,
Mhm.
right? I always tell people to be careful because my sense of humor and just my writing style are very different than his. And I don't want people picking up one of my books thinking they're going to get another Hitchhikers and being disappointed because, of course, it's me. One reviewer, though, who was very prescient, very good about that, and really made me think about this a lot. One of the comparisons he made was to an author named Tom Robbins, who wrote Even Cowgirls Get the Blues and a variety of other novels. And his style is to always have humor on the go and to always have things happening. Very similar to what I do. So if there are precedents, he was definitely, as soon as the reviewer mentioned his name, I was like, right, yes, that makes perfect sense. A lot of literary writers. I'm a huge fan of Thomas Pynchon. You can see a lot of Pynchon stylistic things in my writing. What I usually say when people ask me about influences, that there are two major ones, two conscious ones that I'm always aware of while I'm writing. Monty Python's Flying Circus and the Marx Brothers.
And neither one of those are speculative fiction.
Um,
Well, I mean, I guess Monty Python can kind of go in that realm because of obviously the quest for the Holy Grail.
and yeah, there was a spaceship in Life of Brian, you may recall.
And well,
So
that could be a fantasy story all on itself, can't it?
well, there you go. Yeah, there was a great episode of it. Sorry, there was a great episode of the TV series where alien blancmanges came and they were eating up tennis stars because they wanted to win at Wimbledon. And that was an entire episode in the final season. But in any case, so from those two comedy groups, I learned two very important lessons, which I always sort of have in front of my brain when I'm writing. One is volume, and the other is variety. Okay, so volume, it's really simple. Jokes come at you all the time. Humor comes at you all the time. Every line has humor in it. Every paragraph has more humor in it. Characters have humor in them. So there's always something for the reader to kind of grab a hold of and laugh at. But one of the things you find with a lot of writers is that they have a particular set of comedy devices that they always come back to. They have one single comedy voice that they always come back to. And the problem with that is that one of the main sort of features of humor, one of the things that makes it work so much, so well, is surprise. And the problem is, if you're only using one kind of humor, the reader will eventually catch up with you, and you'll lose that element of surprise. And even if, the second half of your novel is as great, as well written as the first half, the reader won't find it so funny. So variety is also the second and very key sort of element. I use all of the different comic devices that I know of, right? There's irony, there's wordplay, there's strange characters, there's weird plot elements. There's anything and everything. And the whole point is to mix it up in such a way that the reader is constantly off guard, constantly surprised. And my goal, my hope, is that they're still laughing as hard at the end of the book as they were at the beginning.
What are you trying to attain with the science fiction element, though? I mean, I understand the comedic. Where do you grab the science fiction at? Where does that kind of inspire you?
Well, partially because I was a science fiction fan when I was a kid, and I've read a lot of science fiction now as an adult. So, science fiction is there, but always there in my mind. But to answer your question specifically, science fiction gives me a set of metaphors that I can use to say the sorts of things I want to say. So, for instance, the 8th book in the Alternate Reality News Service series, the Alternate Reality News Service sends reporters into other universes, and then they come and write about what they find there. It's been described as a science fiction version of The Onion. And the 8th book, Arns and the Man, is a pretty sustained political parody of Trump America.
Oh yeah, I was reading a little bit of that one. As a Canadian, kind of looking down into America, I mean, I'm not a fan of Trump, so don't think that I'm trying to defend the guy or whatever. But I mean, it's gotta seem absurd that we have this man leading our country.
Exactly, exactly. There are so many things I could say about that, but just to finish my thought, so I can get away with saying things um, because I'm looking at a version of Trump in another universe,
Hmm.
right? A version of America that's in another universe. So um, it gives me a bit of distance to be funny about it. Whereas if I were sort of more, if it was more direct satire and I was just, naming names and being direct about it, um, I don't think it would go down as easily for a lot of readers. A lot of readers would be put off by it, would find it maybe a little too strident, a little too harsh, right?
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, it's definitely that the metaphors and the distance are two things that science fiction really helps me with.
I mean, as a science fiction fan myself, when I hear the words, well, the word multi-universe or the multiverse, it makes my imagination just go crazy. I mean, there are so many varieties that you can do with that, so many places you can go. I mean, it's infinite, the variety that you can actually attain. And when you add absurdism to that, I mean, that just makes it a whole lot more fun to play with. I mean, your canvas is so broad. Basically, do anything you want with it. Do you follow characters throughout your novels?
Yes, yes,
So they reoccur. They recur.
they do. They do. Part of that was just so I mean I try to uh, develop them organically, right? So that they flow out of ideas that seem natural. So just to give you one example, the main sort of organization in the novels is the Transdimensional Authority. They're kind of like the trans-universal travel police. There are pretty dire circumstances that happen if you let people travel through universes just willy-nilly on their own. We kind of see that. There's an example of that in the first book. So the Transdimensional Authority, um, the way I describe them is if you're somewhere you shouldn't be doing something you shouldn't be doing, they're the ones who find you, stop you, and take you back to where you belong. And the first novel follows two of the main Transdimensional Authority investigators. Um, and the rest of them I kind of described offhandedly as fire hydrants with limbs and dark glasses, right?
Uh-huh.
Because this is how I sort of view police generally. They're just these big, bulky guys with limbs, almost always guys, right?
Hmm.
And so that seemed to be, an appropriate way to describe the Transdimensional Authority investigators. After I had written the first book and I was thinking, okay, well, now I've got my first novel published, I kind of need to write another one. I thought that was unfair to the other characters, that they were, although they might sort of all fit into one kind of physical type, um, they're all individuals and they're all characters on their own. So what the second book the second book is called "You Can't Kill the Multiverse, but You Can Mess with Its Head," and the second book is a series of interlocking investigations where a lot of the minor characters from the first book are now front and center, and that gave me a chance to correct what I thought was that unfair bit in the first book and actually explore a lot of these other characters that I had introduced. And so the books kind of develop in that way. Oftentimes there is something or someone from one book that I think, oh, I should really expand upon that. And often that ends up being how the novels develop.
Wow, it's really cool. I mean, basically, you've built a world building here within the multiverse with these absurdist science fiction novels.
Absolutely. The great thing about it, and one of the things that struck me, because I also have a bunch of short stories involving various characters from the novels, And every time I write a new story, it's like, wow, my universe is getting bigger, right? My world is getting bigger. And I do think, or I hope, that people who read more than one of the books will find that the world itself becomes more real to them as they read more into it. And that's not something I would have expected when I was writing the first novel. It's just something that I've come to realize over time.
That people are expecting what?
No, no,
From
no.
you?
That my world is expanding as I keep writing in it. Everything builds on everything else and makes things more real.
How much study have you done on the idea of the multiverse to get kind of the basis of your novels down?
Well, I have read some quantum physics. The quantum physics for beginners, right? The
Yeah.
popular quantum physics. So I know the basics, but this is one of those areas where it's fun to write about something even if you don't necessarily believe in it. So
Well,
the
that's where the
truth of the
fiction elements come from, isn't it? I mean, you don't have to know everything. You get to imagine the parts that you don't understand. What I love is that Einstein didn't even say anything about the multiverse, and he gets attributed with it. I mean, this is basically fiction. This is science fiction. This is nothing more than just a playground to put words in, and character and story and setting. It's beautiful stuff.
that's that Einstein would get any sort of credit or blame for this is really weird to me, because Einstein was very much opposed to quantum physics. He described quantum entanglement as a spooky, what was it? Spooky movement from a distance or something like that. He was very much opposed to quantum physics. So the fact that anybody would connect him to the multiverse is just, anybody who actually knows any of the science is very strange. But what I wanted to get at was that even if there are other universes, and I'm not sure there are, the possibility that we could actually travel to them, as far as I can tell, has no real basis in any sort of science that we now understand. But it doesn't matter, right? As you said, as I said earlier, it's fun to think about these things.
Yeah.
In the first novel, the main character, Numi Rapier, goes to a variety of different universes in her investigation. And in the first 4 universes, she meets different versions of herself. And one of the things that I wanted to do was explore how the choices we make and just random chance things that happen to us make us the people who we are. Right. So, for instance, in one chapter, one of her encounters is with a version of her who is a military officer, and that's because she was born, the universe that she was born into, the world was at war. She did not have the choice to become a transdimensional authority investigator. Her choices went in other directions, and that was something that was, that's beyond her control. That's beyond all of our control, right?
Mm.
In another universe, she's a mother of 2 children, and when the 2 Numis start talking with each other, one of the things they realize is that they were both in love with the same boy in high school, but one of them dumped him and the other one married him. That was her choice, right? And so it's a complicated idea how chance and choice make us the people we are. But hopefully, if I've written it well enough, the novel illustrates, how that can actually work.
What do they say about reality? It's based on your own existence, right? I mean, you create your reality through your existence. And it's interesting to be able to peel back that a little bit and look at the choices that you've made and kind of see how they branch off how your character either marries her high school sweetheart or she doesn't, or she becomes a military officer, or she becomes a criminal or something along those lines. That's what's so fascinating about it. But as somebody who really doesn't know if the universe can split into realities like that, what I mean, why the multiverse then? You don't really think that there are other realities, right?
I'm agnostic. I don't know for sure.
I love that, because then you can question and put whatever colors you want into your reality.
Well, exactly. But, you know, as I was saying earlier, you don't have to believe in it to use it as the basis for what is essentially a thought experiment that allows you to explore the themes you want to explore, right?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I love the idea of a multiverse. I love the idea of choice and how the consequences create waves. And again, like that palette and that canvas, I mean, you can create so much with it.
It's weird, though. I mean, have you been following Discovery, the new Star Trek series?
I watched up to about the third episode. I don't like the Klingons. They drive me crazy.
Okay. Um,
But
in
I
another,
want to hear your point, definitely. So don't get derailed. I am a Star Trek fan.
oh, no, no problem. In another life, I'm a member of the Klingon Assault Group, so I'm a Klingon, actually. And there is a big debate about the Klingons among us Klingons. But the reason I bring it up is because so you would not have gone to this, and I'm sorry, there will be spoilers here. I'll let people know in advance. But the spore drive that they use to get around their universe actually gets them to other universes as well. And
oh, that's interesting.
in the
So every time
final,
they travel in the Star Trek universe, in their universe, they're actually traveling to a different universe.
well, no, they're probably traveling within their universe. But one thing that happens a couple of episodes after you've stopped watching is that um, the spore drive kind of goes nuts, and they end up in the mirror universe.
Oh, yeah, I did not
Uh,
watch that. The last episode I saw is when they jettisoned the spore drive into space.
yeah, yeah. And here's the thing. So at the end of the season, they get back to their universe, and they decide not to tell anybody that you can actually travel between universes. And their rationale for that is that if people knew that there were other universes where they had better lives or they had made better decisions or whatever, everybody would get depressed and kill themselves, or something dramatic would happen, right? The exact opposite of how you and I sort of view the multiverse as a place of fun.
It,
Different
op-
people
it
have different
opens some
attitudes.
it opens some icky conundrums, though, doesn't it? In terms of, if you have the access to go into the multiverse and visit yourself, you do nothing more than confuse the multiverse that you visited, right? I mean, you interrupt that life form's like path forward, and now it's aware of you.
Well, absolutely. I mean, so one of the things that happens in the first novel, and it kind of affects how people perceive the multiverse in the rest of the novels, is that it's revealed that if people are allowed to cross timelines too often, if people are allowed to go in and out of universes too often, um, linear causality starts to break down, and those particular universes that are affected end up being very inhospitable to life. Very weird, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you know, time and space become very different from what we normally experience, and it's hard to exist in those universes and stay sane. And so that's why the transdimensional authority has the authority to make sure that only authorized people travel between universes. But there are other things too, and maybe it's just because I've thought a lot about this. I've been thinking about the multiverse for many years. So yes, one of the things you will find if you start looking at other universes is that there are an infinite number of other universes where you have a better life, however you define better, right? But there are also an infinite number of universes where you have a worse life, right? It isn't in any way judgment on the life you're actually leading now. It can't be. One of the things that's, so not many people, because of the constricted way I view the multiverse, not many people can travel between universes. But I also have a companion technology which allows people to look into other universes, right?
That's
It's sort of like a multiverse TV, if you will, right? But it's an infinite reality show because you've got an infinite number of universes. And most people realize fairly quickly that there really isn't much point in finding yourself. You'll be better, you'll be worse, it'll be different, but there isn't anything to learn, right? One of the other things that sort of comes up in the first novel is Numi, who is a relatively new investigator, thinks, well, I'll just look at what happened in another universe and we'll solve the crime that way, right? And her partner, Crash Chumley, has to point out to her that
these are great names, by the way.
Thank you.
These are really good names. I like them a lot. Very original, and they're fun to listen to. Crash Drumley, did you say?
Crash Chumley.
Chumley, and then Numi. What's her
Numi
last
Rapier,
name?
yeah.
Rapier. These are great names.
That was a Thomas Pynchon thing. He always has great names too. Crash has to point out to her that anything that happens in another universe is not necessarily a guidepost in what happens in this universe, right? Because obviously they're different. So you may come up with the villain in the other universe, or you may come up with somebody who's completely innocent in this universe. There's no way of telling, so you have to fall back on your investigation in this universe. As it happens, what she ends up watching is a television version of herself and Crash in the other universe. Right? In fact, one of my favorite things to read in the fifth novel, in the most recent novel, The Multiverse is a Nice Place to Visit, but I wouldn't want to live there. The main driver of the plot is that somebody is transferring the consciousness of people from one universe to another. And it starts off small with just one guy whose consciousness ends up in his same body, but in a different universe. But one of the chapters involves the bridge crew of a starship. And their consciousnesses end up being transferred, and we don't find this out until later in the novel, but their consciousnesses end up being transferred into the bodies of avatars in a computer game that's based on their starship.
It's very reminiscent of a Black Mirror episode that came out this last season. Are you familiar with that show?
I am familiar with that show, and I have read about that episode, but I haven't seen it yet. If there was an inspiration for that, it may have actually been not Black Mirror, but are you familiar with Life on Mars?
Oh, I don't believe so.
Okay, Life on Mars is an amazing British TV series. It's about a cop who, in the first episode, a modern cop, a cop from the time it was shot, I believe 5 or 10 years ago now. In the first episode, he's hit by a car and he regains consciousness in the 1970s. And it's about the difference in policing between the 70s and the modern era. And it's pretty amazing. There was so that show goes on for 2 years. Then there's a sequel called Ashes to Ashes, and you may recognize they're both David Bowie songs.
Yeah, that's what I just looked it up on Google, and that was the first thing that popped up. I was like, no, David Bowie wasn't on a TV show. And then I scrolled down a little bit and discovered I was right.
And then there was a season, an American spin-off that happened that only lasted a year, starring Harvey Keitel, actually, which was pretty interesting. And at the end of that show, a very different ending than the British ending, by the way. At the end of that show, it turns out that it's a spaceship. The guy has been on a spaceship the whole time. All of the other characters from the 70s are his crew members, his crew. And it was kind of, they've been in suspended animation on a trip to Mars. And this was, I forget if it was the AI that was giving them dreams or if it was just him dreaming in suspended animation. So that's, that to me was kind of, okay, this is how you play with consciousness. And that may have been the spark for that particular chapter of my most recent book.
It's interesting. How do you travel in your novels, multiverse to multiverse, or from reality to reality?
There is a technology. It's called the dimensional portal. The Transdimensional Authority has 7 of them. They're 3 stories tall, and they look like cat's eyes on end. Or, for more graphically minded of you, they look like a piece of human anatomy that probably is best left unmentioned.
Okay, I pictured it.
Okay.
Well, that's very fascinating.
And
I mean, as far as interdimensional travel, you have a bunch of stuff to kind of work with, don't you? In terms of the zeitgeist. I mean, you have what, Stargate? What was it, Stargate? The movie with oh God.
well,
MacGyver was in the TV show.
Yep. Yeah. My original, I'll tell you. So my original inspiration was actually a couple of movies. One was called Sliding Doors, and the other is called La Double Vie de Véronique, The Double Life of Veronique, a French film.
Mm-hmm.
And they're both about a woman who makes a choice, and then we watch as her life goes in 2 completely different directions. Also, there's a German film called Run Lola Run.
Oh yeah,
which
good movie.
Has 3 different kind of storylines, all based on one storyline, based on different choices.
Mm-hmm.
But Sliding Doors and The Double Life of Veronique were interesting to some extent, but what I felt was lacking in them was that they only gave binary choices, right? So you only have one choice point, and you only make 2 choices, and your life goes in 2 different directions. And one of the things I stressed in the first book was, well, we have choice points at every point in our life. And what you end up with is branching trees of choices, right? Yeah. So one choice leads to another choice that leads to another.
I think that's what's most exciting about the multiverse to me, is that there are infinite number of choices. I mean, maybe you can count them. Maybe there could be numbers, but I mean, there are various ways anything can go. In terms of me pacing back and forth in my office, I mean, I can, trip over something. Not really a choice of my own, more fate, but that could really impact the rest of this conversation, or even for that matter, the rest of my life. And I mean, your choices impact other people too. The chaotic nature of the universe is so amazing. I mean, we could live our perfect lives, and all of a sudden, a collision millions and billions of miles away could impact us in space. An asteroid lands and crushes us both. I mean, we're basically neighbors geographically. I mean, the multiverse is chaos, isn't it? Chaos.
It is, but then, I kind of think that our individual universe is chaos, and we impose order on it, right?
There's no such thing as order, though, I don't think. We like to imagine, that's the fantasy of the whole thing, is that we think that there's some element of control, but there really isn't any control to anything.
Well, I think we have control over our own actions, and to some extent, we have control over our own thoughts. But you're absolutely right. To a large extent, we don't. And, you know, there are funny things. I think there was a John Cleese movie called Clockwise, where he's a businessman and he has to make a meeting, and the universe seems determined to keep him from getting there, right?
Mm.
And Cleese, of course, does the buttoned down British person slowly losing his cool better than just about anybody on the
Yeah.
planet.
Faulty Towers is one of my favorite series ever, and he does that all the way through, basically just losing his cool every episode.
Exactly.
It's an example though, right? He thinks he's in control, and outside forces are constantly conspiring against him to
Exactly.
upset his existence.
That's exactly the point. Yes. So, one of the things you learn with Buddhism and sort of some other religions like that is that you have to let go of the idea of control.
Yeah.
And one of the things, you know, to quote Firefly, one of the things you have to do is just kind of resign yourself to being a leaf on the wind, right?
Yeah.
Instead of trying to force your path, enjoy the trip wherever it takes you.
The good thing about that, though, well, the opposite thing about that, though, is a leaf doesn't really have much muscle control. You can kind of guide, right? You can kind of force, you can kind of put your feet down and refuse to budge, or you can go with the current, bump into rocks, shove up onto the bank and be stuck. But you really don't have a lot of choice, though. That's the amazing part about it in terms of, like, I was thinking when your characters witness another reality, the jealousy or the idea of it would drive them absolutely insane. Or if the consciousness from one of your characters enters, you know, the same character in another reality, the things that he would expect around him that aren't there anymore would make him go insane. I don't think he could accept the new reality.
Well, one of the things that I actually do in that book, and I guess I'm kind of proud of it, is that after the consciousnesses have been switched back, the Transdimensional Authority actually has a group of people who are involuntary transdimensional travel therapists, right?
So I was hoping that you would say something like that, right? They would they help you get used to your new reality, or get used
they
to the
help you
idea
adjust
of
back to your own reality when you've been exposed to another one, not by choice, right?
How do you handle it with a therapist? Do they have to, is it like a long process to get people to kind of accept that there are multiple realities out there and that theirs is just one out of infinite numbers of potentiality?
Well, the people on Earth Prime, where the technologies for the transdimensional travel were first developed. I mean, they're all clear that there is a multiverse, even if most of them will never actually travel to other universes. So that's not the problem. The problem is, as you sort of alluded to earlier, when somebody has taken the choice away from you and sent you to another universe, you're not prepared for it. It may be quite different from the one you experience, and it's a real shock to you that you are there experiencing it. The therapist kind of helps walk you through why it's okay, but you're home now. You're back with the universe that you understand. And that's okay. And that actually only takes about 2 hours. And of course, the reason is because the Transdimensional Authority is a bureaucracy. They're not going to pay for, years of your therapy.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I love it. It's really beautiful. I love the ideas that you're coming up with. I'm very curious though. You said that you were a Klingon at one point in your existence, or another reality. So you are a big Trekkie, or are you a Trekker? Which one do you consider yourself?
Okay, so here's the thing. To promote my writing, I go to a lot of science fiction conventions, and I ended up meeting a lot of Klingons at science fiction conventions. And the Klingons in Toronto, where I live, have an annual feast, and they started inviting me. And the Klingons, perhaps counterintuitively, are some of the sweetest people I've ever met, and I love hanging out with them. So eventually they invited me to become a Klingon, and I like Star Trek. I prefer Star Trek to Star Wars. But I'm not the sort of guy who can debate about the finer points of the schematics of the starship.
Uh-huh.
Right? I'm not that far into it, but excuse me. You know, I have realized that, you know, if I'm going to be a member of the Klingon of CAG, that, you know, I should do it right. So we have been building my costume, and I'm told this summer that I will be fitted with the forehead ridges. So hopefully I'll have a complete actual costume by the end of the year.
That's cool. And you plan on doing some, what do they call it? You dress up and go to cons. Coscon?
Yeah, cosplay.
Cosplay. Thank you, man. My mind is gone. I don't know what happened to it.
I hear you.
Do you speak Klingon?
No, I don't. And it's now because I'm maybe a little getting on in age, and I just can't pick up languages the way I used to. So probably not going to happen. But all you have to do is kind of stand there and look tough and grunt every so often, and I should be fine.
As a Canadian, though, you probably speak French, right? Or is that unless you're from Montreal, Quebec?
Well, I got my PhD in Montreal. I got my PhD from McGill University. So I did live there for 3 years. And we do take a lot of French in public school. I butcher the language. I'm not really good at it, but I actually understand quite a bit of it, even though I don't speak it all that well.
What did you get your PhD in?
My PhD is in communications. Okay, so my master's degree was done through Paul Levinson's Connected Education. Many people might know Paul Levinson as a science fiction writer, as a former head of SIFWA. But I know Paul Levinson primarily as a pioneer in online education. So I was living in Toronto, and I was getting my degree from the New School for Social Research, which is based in New York. It was an amazing experience. And oddly enough, 10 years after I graduated, I met Paul Levinson face-to-face for the first time at an academic conference in New York. And it was one of those weird sort of, I mean, you know, having him as my master's thesis advisor, it's an intense process. So you think you know somebody very well. So it was like, I know you, and yet I'm meeting you for the first time. It was one of those weird internet sort of things, right? My master's thesis was on interactive storytelling, the challenges of storytelling for writers who want to write for interactive media. Because I was looking at, was interested in the intersection between creativity and technology. So when I go to McGill to do my PhD ended up being about writers, fiction writers who post their fiction online, right? Now, this was in the late 1990s, mid to late 1990s when I was doing my PhD. So this was long before Patreon. This was long before all of the outlets that people have online now. It was mostly people who were just like posting stories to web pages, essentially. And it's an interesting, I still think it's a very interesting portrait of an early time, and some very early first adapters, artists who were first adapters of the new technology. So, yeah, that's
fascinating. So basically, you were studying what is happening now before it actually started happening.
well, in its early years. The thing you have to remember is that by the time something becomes really public, it's probably been developed over 10, 15, or 20 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
What After I graduated from McGill, I came back to Toronto and worked for a couple of years with a woman who taught at the McLeod Center at the University of Toronto. I helped her teach her course one term and spent a lot of time steeping myself in McLeod. And one of the things McLuhan said was that artists are the antennae of the human race. And the thing about that is that McLuhan went on to argue that it's not that artists see the future more clearly, it's that artists see the present more clearly. Most people, when they think about what's going on now, they're really seeing what's going on maybe 5 or 10 years ago. Artists can, on the other hand, are really clued into what's going on now, and that's why, they often surprise you with something, even though you look around and you're like, oh yeah, that's actually right. This is a great example of that would be Neuromancer by William Gibson.
Oh yeah.
Neuromancer was written in 1984, and Gibson has said that he based his idea of virtual reality on what he saw in computer arcades and computer arcade games. So it was there, right? The idea of actually inserting yourself into other realities was in the culture, but he saw it in a way that nobody else had, right? Now, of course, virtual reality is kind of a duh. We all sort of are familiar with it, even if we haven't actually achieved it yet.
And he was writing his novel and he stumbled upon somebody else that already wrote his ideas. He got frustrated and said, what am I doing? And thankfully, he finished his work and published it. And, now it's kind of a science fiction classic. The interesting thing about your studies is I wonder if it kind of guessed at the idea of the cult of the amateur that's currently happening now. The copy and pasting that's currently going on, where things are completely free on the internet. Money is hard to get. Publishers are folding. Broadcasters are going away. I mean, journalists are not making any money anymore because everything is available for free.
Yes, I dealt with all of those issues. So it was pretty. So one of the I did a survey of writers online, and one of the questions I asked was, why are you publishing online rather than in print, more traditional venues? And a lot of them said, well, it allows me to bypass the gatekeepers, right? It allows me to send my stuff out to potential readers without having to worry that the magazine editor is going to not accept my story, which was and remains legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
But another question I asked is, so what is your sense of who your readers are? And most of the people who responded to that question said, I have no idea. Do I even have readers? Right?
Exactly, right.
And I pointed out at the time, this would be 1999 when I wrote it, that the great thing about the internet is that anybody can publish. And the worst thing about the internet is that anybody can publish, right? And, one of the major problems is when you were submitting, say, short stories to magazines, so you were competing with the hundreds of other people who were submitting short stories to that particular magazine. When you try to build an audience on the internet, you're competing with the millions of other people who have stories on the internet. And one of the things that was well known even back then was the problem is that art is multiplying hugely. You now have, as a reader, you now have far more material than you ever had before, but you don't have more time.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. If you want something to read, you could find it. But along with that one thing, there are millions of other things you could be reading as well. You can only
Yeah,
read one thing at
exactly.
once. You can only listen to one thing at once. And there's tons of material. There's tons of content out there. I mean, we definitely live in the age of content.
Yep, absolutely. And, so how do you make yourself known? Well, you do interviews like this, I guess.
Yeah, me and you both. We're guessing. I mean,
Well, I know, look, I'm a member of SF Canada, which is kind of the Canadian version of SIFWA.
mhm.
And we trade tips all the time about how to get recognized, how to get more people to you. And we're all guessing. Nobody really knows, right? I remember there was this great article, and I wish I could find it because a couple of months after I read it, I was looking for it and I couldn't find it. But it was about the success of, I believe it was Hugh Howey's Wool.
Oh yeah, that's the
Right.
name I was just thinking about because he is an aberration, isn't he? He
Well,
and this guy, his name Andy Weir, who did The Martian,
yep.
they found success. They found an audience. How? You know, they did it in a miraculous way that made them millions of dollars too.
Well, so this article, absolutely brilliant. It tried to figure out what Hugh Howey actually did that made his book a success. And it went through some of the things that they tell you to do to market your books online, many of which he didn't do. It tells you what not to do to market your books online, many of which he did. And the conclusion that the article came to was this. He had maybe, I don't know, 20 to 50 people who found his work online, who loved it, who then went on to sell his work to friends and family and their social networks. And it grew out of that. So that social network then, there were enough people in that social network to spread the word to other people, right? It went viral, to use the current phrase. And that's great, except for one thing. You cannot replicate that. There are probably 50 people who, if they found my books, would love them and get that kind of viral thing started. But I have no idea who they are. There is no way of knowing who they are,
Yeah.
right? So the only thing you can do is put yourself out in as many different areas as you can and hope that one of them is the one that clicks for you. Right?
Well,
Now,
you can't write to be successful. You have to write the story and keep writing the story and finish the story and then write the next story. And you do the things A, B, and C that follow the story, but you really can't hope that anything's going to really take off. I mean, I talk about Andy Weir all the time. He's like one of my go-to stories about this exact same subject. Have you read The Egg?
The Egg? No.
Oh, you've read The Egg. The Egg is a brilliant short story. It's like 800 words. It's about a guy who dies in a traffic accident and he goes to heaven and he has a conversation with some kind of deity figure. And they discuss what the afterlife is, what life is, what the universe is. And, you know, basically it's a reincarnation story. And boom, been translated into 25 languages. And it's what gave him his audience. And the audience is what made it possible for him to write The Martian. And obviously, The Martian is what catapulted him into the fame that he has today, if you're familiar with that work.
Oh, for sure. Great movie. One other person who also fits into this category, and not many people are aware of it, is John Scalzi.
Yes, and he's one of my fans. I'm a big fan of his and only read one of his books, but not even read it, Red Shirts. But yeah, he's a genius at the marketing thing because he doesn't even market anything. He doesn't.
Well,
When you look on his Twitter, it's just about his books. It's not about his books; it's about other people's books, and it's about his cats, and it's about what he's traveling to and what he's eating, and has nothing to do with what he's actually got out there in the world for you to buy, which is incredibly interesting.
absolutely. And this is one of the things that frustrates me no end. I'm on Twitter, and I will follow any writer who follows me. It's a rule I have. I will support writers by following them. But so many writers, the only thing that they seem to post is buy my book, right?
Horrible
And
mistake.
it's terrible marketing.
It's horrible.
When my tech goddess talked me into doing social media, to talk me into getting onto Twitter, one of the first things that I decided was I'm not going to be that guy. And so one of the things I do is that I have a monthly theme, usually around puns or other wordplay, that has nothing to do with my writing. It's just actually another creative outlet for me. It's fun for me, and hopefully it's fun for the people I follow. I do a lot of retweeting, but never buy my book. I retweet a lot of political stuff because satirist, that's what I'll do, right? So I hope, that my feed is interesting. And then if people think you're interesting, maybe they'll look into your work, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the hope anyway. I follow the same kind of thinking as well. I don't want to push anything for people to buy. In fact, it makes me totally uncomfortable to even suggest you pay anything or give me money or whatever have you. And I'm actually just trying to get other people's names out there. Like my podcast. I mean, it's all about my guest. It's all about the subject matter. It has nothing to do with me.
That's part of the job. You can't get away from it. I mean, one of the things I tell people is that I am a recovering shy person. And yeah, when I started going to cons, it was just torture, behind my table, selling my books, just talking to strangers about what an awesome writer I am, right? And two things. One, obviously, the more you do it at cons, the better you get. But it's also true that one of the things that really brought me out of my shell was teaching at a university. And because when you're in a class of 30 people and they're looking at you to talk for an hour like you know what you're talking about, you have to know what you're talking about, right? You have to develop that confidence that you know what you're talking about. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to teach other people. So those two things.
It seems like you have a good personality too. It comes across very well.
Oh,
the way you present yourself is either you're very good at the practice of public presenting, or you've got a good personality.
Well, thank you.
Or you win.
Well,
Congratulations.
One of the things that I realized is that my dad is just a great oral storyteller. He's got some great stories from all sorts of different points in his life, and so I must have learned that from him, right?
What did he do for a living?
Well, so my dad was a Holocaust survivor. He came to Canada as an orphan. His parents died in the Holocaust.
Wow.
He and much of my family came over then. He spoke no English. He came to English Canada, so he had to learn English. He became an accountant, and he was, well, I mean, it was the 60s and 70s. He was part of that sort of flower power generation, and he has a lot of stories from then. But he had a strong sense of social justice, and he, within his ability as an accountant, he always wanted to make election law fair, right? So he actually, over the course of his life, he advised many of the governments on Canada and became one of the most well-respected and well-known experts in financing elections, and particularly fair financing of elections, so that big money doesn't just kind of take over.
I wonder if we could think of any country south of you that's actually happened in. Mexico? That's sad.
But
It really is sad. It's horrible. We needed people like your father in this country. Unfortunately, we didn't get them to
well,
open up and kind of help us not
yeah,
get into this hole that we're currently in.
he also, so when he was first starting out, he was an accountant for a stockbroker who gamed the system, can we say?
Mm.
He has lots of colorful stories from that period of his life. Um, just so many stories. I mean, he could turn what happened to him yesterday, just standing in a line in a bakery waiting to buy bread or something, into an interesting story, right?
Hmm.
And so, I am kind of a natural mimic, if you will. There was one time when I was casting a radio play, and I was working with a musician to see if he could do sound effects. And he had this great Irish accent. And 5 minutes into the conversation about sound effects, I realized that I was talking back to him in an Irish accent, and I quickly stopped, right? But and I hoped that he wasn't insulted. Um, but I just unconsciously pick up things from whatever is around me, which I think is a great asset as a writer. And so, I must have picked up a lot of storytelling prowess from just listening to the stories that my dad told. Now, you know, that doesn't change the fact that I was still really shy and nervous, and I had to overcome that before that ability could really manifest.
Hmm. And I mean, you're part of the process. I mean, you're part of the whole shebang, basically. I mean, what you're putting out there on Twitter is important. How you present yourself is important. It's just it's all part of the, not the novel's good by itself, but you have to go along with that novel. And Scalzi kind of does that. Going back to him, that's what he kind of does. He's part of the he's part of the product.
Well, but his first novel was also originally published online, right? And
Oh, I
that
didn't know
helped
that.
him.
That's what.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, but that was my point, right? He used the internet, like this would be 20 or more years ago now,
Yeah.
to kickstart his career. Somebody saw that, a publisher saw that, and I may not be getting the story exactly right, but as I remember it, a publisher saw that. I believe was it Agent to the Stars?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either, but didn't want a comic novel, didn't want a humorous novel, but the agent was really keen on him, so he wrote uh, old is it Old Man's
Yeah,
War?
it's old
Yeah,
man, something like that. Old Man's War, or something like
right.
that. Yeah.
Gets that published, and his career takes off. But it starts on the internet, right?
And
So
thinking about it now, I'm aware he does have a gigantic following with his blog. That's
yep,
his website's very important to his process.
and it's brilliant. I love whatever. I follow it religiously, and one of the things I admire about Scalzi is the big idea. So he lets writers come in and talk about their books, and use his fame, like his reach, to promote themselves, right? As his way of giving back to the writing community, I guess.
Yeah.
I think that's a great thing. I admire him for doing that, and also because I love reading other writers' process. So I love reading the big idea.
So I mean, you have Scalzi 20 years ago. You have you Howie, who I don't think is recent. Maybe in the last 10 years when he published Wool and kind of captured his fame. What's the next wave, though? What I mean, that's what I'm trying to rack my brain against, is what's going to happen into the future. Obviously, somebody has to rise to the top, right? The cream has to settle. What is that cream? How do you get it? Where is it going to be? Who's the
Well,
next Scalzi?
okay, so I'll tell you, because we also wanted to talk, I hope, about amazing stories. So I lucked into a gig at Amazing Stories. It looks like I will be the editor of. I have been the editor of the online publication, and it looks like I'll be the editor of the print version of the magazine once it starts publishing. We're aiming for our first issue in August to coincide with Worldcon. And I'll be honest with you, I think we're in kind of a fallow time. This is definitely not a golden age of science fiction. I think a lot of people sort of understand that. There are great writers, and there are popular writers, and even once in a while, the popular writers are great. But in terms of, defining the genre, like people like Asimov or Clarke or Heinlein or people like that, we don't seem to have those giants. And my feeling, and what I hope to accomplish with the magazine, is that my feeling is that we're going to find them in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect. I'm hoping that Amazing Stories will have an international reach and an international vibe. We have connections, for instance, to Latin America. There's a very thriving science fiction community in Latin America, and we hope to.
Very interesting point, because it does seem like a lot of magazines and a lot of online publications are seeking that unheard voice.
Yeah.
The cultures that don't typically write science fiction, they want them. Not
One of the
necessarily women, but they want people of color. They want people of different religions and histories and cultures and whatnot. It does seem like that's what people are reaching for right now.
Yeah,
or publishers anyway.
I pointed out to somebody recently that that cultural change never comes from the center. So cultural change always comes from the margins, comes from the outside, comes from the people who don't have a lot of popularity to begin with, and they just kind of over time work their way inside. Latin America is one of them. China is a big market, and it has a
three-body
lot.
problem. They actually are producing great science fiction.
Yeah, and you're seeing Chinese authors in a lot of magazines now. I have connections to French Canada, so I'm hoping to get some translations of French stories. And the trick is to stick with it and really, the trick is to find a balancing act between established and new, and hope that you'll bring in the readers with the established writers, and they will follow you to the new writers, right? And so in that way, you can affect change. It's a balancing act. I'm not sure we'll get it right in the first issue, but hopefully over time, we'll be able to do that and make some serious inroads into reinvigorating the genre.
It's a big task to take upon yourselves, to reinvigorate something that's been around for, I don't know, what would you call it, hundreds of years? You're pulling a lot of history behind you.
It depends on how you measure these things. For people who aren't familiar with it, Amazing Stories was the first science fiction magazine. There had been science fiction stories published in Modern Electronics and other magazines that weren't specifically fiction magazines. But Amazing Stories was the first solely fiction science fiction magazine. The first issue was published in April of 1926, over 90 years ago. The publisher was Hugo Gernsback, of course, the guy the Hugo Awards was named after. And yes, I'm aware that there's a lot of history, not even in the genre, but within Amazing Stories itself. And again, my hope, my goal, and we won't necessarily get it right the first issue, but over time, hopefully we'll get it right, is to both respect where science fiction has been, but to find interesting new places to take it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because people love Lovecraft. They love Howard. They love Asimov. They love the names that came before, the ones who've been writing the stories. I mean, what are you going to possibly publish some of the old stuff in the catalog? Can you revisit what's already been published?
We will. We don't actually have access to a lot of the old material, unfortunately, so that's not actually an option for us. Are you still there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't
okay.
sure. Okay. So we don't have access to the back catalog, so we can't actually do that. I do have a couple of reprints in the pipeline, stuff that I just particularly admire and would love to give a new audience to. But when I talk about respecting the past, it's not about that, because one of the things you're going to find is that we have moved on, certainly from the early contributions to Amazing Stories. Some
the
of them,
technology definitely has moved on too. I mean, you can't write the same way that Heinlein was writing. You can't do that because it's not proper anymore to kind of make that stuff up.
well, that's partially true, but also, just in terms of storytelling, we have a different style of storytelling, one that doesn't necessarily, we jump into the action right away. Most writers will start their story at a dramatic point, and then if they have to, give backstory or character, they'll put it along the way, or maybe we'll go back or whatever. It was nothing for the first 5 or 10 pages of a story to be backstory, right? Which may or may not actually, it may set up something, but it's the way we tell stories now is just very different. So you have
to the point where backstory is frowned upon. If you need to tell something backstory, you tell that story.
Yep. Incorporated in some way into the story. So, a lot of what we think of as classic science fiction, I don't know if it would sell now. I don't know if people would appreciate it now, right? So you have to be careful about stuff like that.
I mean, my main question is who is buying stuff? I mean, who are the buyers? Who's pulling out the debit card and buying copies, or who you're hoping to buy copies of American Story? Or who am I selling my novels to? Or who, is anybody trying to get money from? Because it doesn't seem like there's money out there anymore. It seems like everything is free. I mean, if you really want a science fiction story, go on Twitter and wait 5 minutes. Somebody's going to tweet you a link.
We're in a very weird sort of position because, in one sense, science fiction is hotter than it's been in a long, long time. There's so many TV series and movies that are science fiction. Like I think the top 10 grossing films of last year, 7 or 8 of them were science fiction, right? If you include the Marvel.
I was about to say, if you include the comic book movies, definitely.
Yeah. So science fiction is definitely having a moment in the media.
I would even almost say speculative fiction is having its moment, because a lot of that stuff is fantasy.
Fair enough. Yep, fair enough. But in print, completely different subject. And I think, part of it is what you want to do is have people love the work so much that they want to pay to support it. Right. And I'll be honest, part of that is, and this is a hard lesson I learned, but I learned it at cons. Part of it is to make people like you enough to want to support you in whatever you do, right?
I've noticed that too. At the Patreon model, I mean, getting your fans to donate money to you on a monthly basis, kind of giving you an allowance, a Patreon, to continue your work. I mean, I listened to a podcaster named Scott Johnson, who's also an artist. He does comics, little fluffy drawings every once in a while. He makes like $30,000 a month off patrons, people giving him $5 or $10.
Yeah.
I mean, what did Bernie Sanders say? He like $27 per 100,000 donors or something. He almost became president. I mean, it's not about contracts anymore. It's about pittance. It's about pennies.
Well, it's about patrons, right? Listen, before we had our commercial system of payment, patronage was the way to go. Now, granted, it was usually one very rich patron. But okay, this is the system we've got, and at least we have the technology that can connect individuals to patrons.
Yeah.
So,
Well, at least it seems like that anyway. I'm not certain if it's going to work for everybody.
Well, it isn't, but then when did it ever, right? I mean,
Yeah,
most writers, what was it? Most writers make less than $10,000 a year off their writing, right? Not enough to live. So most writers have to have second jobs or patrons or whatever it is to make sure that they have enough money to live on. It has ever been thus. That's not something new, right?
So that's the model that Amazing Stories is going to go for, or how are you going to? I mean, you have a following built in already going into this Kickstarter that you've currently going on. What is your plan going forward with that, the marketing and whatnot?
Well, the Kickstarter is primarily there to get us seed funding through the first issue or two, or if we get enough, maybe the first year or two. Ultimately, the plan is twofold. Most science fiction magazines exist on subscriptions, so we're going to need to develop a subscriber base. What Steve Davidson, the publisher, his sort of model is to give the magazine away free at conventions and use that as a subscription base to get advertising. So we're hoping to build both of those things at the same time. They aren't necessarily, they might seem in conflict, but they aren't necessarily, because a lot of science fiction fans either A, won't get to, don't get to cons in the first place, or B, they might get to one con where one issue is distributed, but then they won't get to the other issues that year are distributed at, right? So I do think so. The plan is to distribute it for free at Worldcon, and hopefully a lot of people excuse me, a lot of people there will like what they see enough to actually get a subscription at some point.
Notice that a lot of magazines like Clark's World or Uncanny or Apex, they're putting podcasts out. They're giving the stories away for free over the wherever. I don't know about their website necessarily, going on there and reading the stories, but you can listen to everything they're publishing. It's incredibly interesting.
Yep. And again, I mean, so the idea is you give a version away for free, and if people like it, they will support you financially. They manage, right?
Yeah, I guess they're putting authors up for you guys, right? I mean, they're getting people famous, getting published in their magazines.
Yeah,
they're making careers. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and yes, I mean, things like awards, very important. They give you credibility as a publication. So, that's out of our control, obviously, but you cross your fingers and hope for the best. It's about building a reputation over time, and we understand.
Well, that's the best thing about Amazing Stories is you already have the reputation. I mean, you say Amazing Stories, I'm like, I know that place.
Well, yes and no, right? It's a weird dichotomy. Again, one of these weird dichotomies where on the one hand, the magazine has a history, but on the other hand, it's been out of print for 10 or 15 years now. So we're really coming back as something new with a history. It's a weird thing, but yes.
Interesting. I'm cheering for you. Where can people go to learn more, or to help, or to what would you like people to know about your Kickstarter and Amazing Stories? And
what I can do, if I haven't already, if I send you the URL of the Kickstarter, can you put it up with the with the interview? 100%. Okay, so I mean, ultimately, that's what we'd love. I'd love to get people to go there. I mean, basically, what I'm telling people is that it's essentially a subscription drive, right? You can, for $10, you can get a year's electronic subscription. For $25, you can get a year's print subscription. And then there are other things that, if you're interested, you can give more money to. but I'm happy with just, people subscribing. Obviously, like all artists, I want the thing to be read by as many people as we can get, right?
Yeah, absolutely. What about you as an artist? Are you still producing?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. My goal is to write 1,000 words a day. Um, I figure I do that about. I don't get every day of the year in, but I do that on average about 300 days a year. So that's a substantial amount of writing. I am trying to. Okay, well, actually, I should mention. So I have a website, Les Pages au Fall. It includes alternate reality news service articles, but it's mostly a satirical website. So there's a lot of non-science fiction humor on it as well. It is now 15 years old. I have been doing it since 2002, which, if you want to keep track, I think I'm up to about 830 consecutive weeks of updates.
That's awesome.
And so that's the voracious maw. That has to be fed every single week. And I was actually talking to another writer, Shirley Meyer, last night, and talking about how the thing about doing a fiction regularly on the internet is, to me, a lot like what it must have been like for writers in the pulp fiction era. You have to learn to write fast, and you have to learn to write up to the best you can write every single time, right? You're not going to do it, so you have to also learn to let go if, one week you just weren't as inspired as other weeks. There's a lot there, but I mean, these were the conditions that the pulp fiction writers wrote under, right?
Mm.
And so yeah.
Well, you said you're feeding the voracious maw. What are you feeding it? Just the updates? Or are you feeding it flash fiction, short fiction, novelettes, novellas?
um Okay, so a typical week will contain three different elements. There is a feature on the website called the Daily Me. It's an old idea from, I think, Nicholas Negroponte at MIT. His idea was that we would all have bots that go out into the internet, and they would put together a newspaper that was individual for every single person based on what their interests were, and it would be the Daily Me. So the Daily Me is just short takes on different things in the news. Then there is the alternate reality news service, and at this point, ordinarily I have one, but because ordinarily I would have one alternate reality news service thing a week, but since Trump came into power, I've been writing anywhere from 2 to 5 a week. So I've had to go to publish 2 a week, not even to keep up, but just not to get too far behind.
You got to be careful saying that stuff, though, because he might want to take some money from you for inspiring you so often.
Oh, let him come. Are you kidding? That would be the best. The best. If he would tweet about me, I don't care what he says. Do you have any idea how many people would be driven to my website?
Just keep amazing stories off of Fox News and you'll be okay.
Well, we have to be clear, right? I mean, my politics in my website are not driving my editorship of amazing stories, right? I'd like to have a wide variety of stories, a wide variety of viewpoints. We'll see what comes in, obviously, but there are certain things, and we make this clear in our guidelines, right? We will not accept sexist or racist material. That's just, not going to happen.
Well, how much of the cult of the personality do you bring to your editorship of amazing stories?
Well, if I was better known, I would say probably a lot. Because I'm not that well known, I'm not sure that really comes into play. What I will say, though, is that both the guidelines and the video for the Kickstarter and some of the text for the Kickstarter have a lot of humor in them.
Mhm.
because anything I do is going to have a lot of humor in it. That's just me. So in that sense, I guess my personality is affecting how the project develops.
It's neat. And I've really enjoyed talking to you. I mean, we're at about
Thank you.
90 minutes right now, and I,
Well, I
I
should have warned you, because I do warn some interviewers that I'm a little wind-up doll. Like, once you just ask the question and get out of the way, and I'll
oh, I
talk your
noticed that
ear
right
off.
away.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, let's see what happens. Just find that key and let him go. Uh, no, I really thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you, and
Well, thank you.
I sum these up basically with three questions. And the first is always, you know, you've been doing this a while, and you've got a lot of good opinions about how to make a career writing. What would you recommend to somebody who maybe is struggling or looking for advice?
Well, again, I don't have the audience. I have the work.
The work is the
What I
most
will
important to
say,
me. The work is the most important thing.
well, what I will say is, and this is some advice I used to give my students when I was a university professor. So, this is something I've thought about for a long time. There is only one reason to become an artist. The only reason to become an artist is because you love making art. If you think you're going to become rich off of being an artist, think again. It rarely happens. If you think you're going to become famous out of being an artist, very unlikely. The thing is, you might spend 30 or 40 years of your life in obscurity, making nothing, and nobody knows you're there. If you hate making art, or if you're indifferent to making art, you've just spent your entire life doing something you don't care about. That's not a really good way to spend a life. On the other hand, if you love making art, then whether or not you become rich or famous, you've just spent 30 or 40 years of your life doing something you love. And how many people can really say that?
Well, at least some artists, anyway.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump, I'm sure he loves what he does.
Yeah, I was thinking very rich people too. But you know what? They're so insecure, right? I mean, part of the reason why you keep making money long after you have more than enough to cover even your wildest needs, there is some insecurity driving people like that, right?
It's
Anyway,
addiction.
sorry.
It's
Yeah,
addiction. It's
yeah,
totally, you get a thrill out of those numbers just rising. And when they stop, you think you're a failure. So you want more and more and more.
yeah.
That's the thing, isn't it? When people do become successful, when they do publish their novel, when they pop that New York Times bestseller list, what does their life mean to them then? I mean, if they've achieved that success, are they still in the mood to make art?
Well, it depends. And it goes back to what I just said, right? If
Yeah.
your love is making art, then you can't be tempted by failure or success, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I pointed out to my students was that, yeah, failure certainly is a trap. You'll get people telling you how to do things, and you might be tempted to move away from your vision of art to please your critics, right? But success is also a trap, because a lot of people, and Douglas Adams is a really good example. I mean, he was done with Hitchhikers after the first three books, and fans would not let up demanding more Hitchhikers books. And eventually the publisher just gave him so much money that he wrote more of them, right? But so success can also be a trap, because fans want you to keep doing what you have done that they already love, instead of growing, right? One of the
And a
things
good
that,
example of that is George Lucas, right? I mean, he got
yeah,
trapped into that Star Wars thing and ultimately ended up, now he's a joke, kind of,
yeah.
a joke. I mean, he
So one of the
ruined his.
things that I, always try to do is make sure that I'm writing something that I haven't written before. I'm working on a novel now, which is in the Transdimensional Authority series, but it's very different from the first five novels. Um, And it's to challenge me to see if I can do it. If I pull it off, it'll perhaps be the best novel in the series. Will I pull it off? Well, there's always a danger that you don't if you're trying new things. But that's the only way you can grow as an artist, if you keep challenging yourself to do new things.
I find it interesting. I think you remind me a lot of like a Terry Pratchett in terms of he's writing about Discworld, but almost every single little part of that series is different, right? I mean, it takes place in a little bit of a different realm of the Discworld series.
And characters weave in and out of it. Some minor characters in one book will be the main characters in another book, and Rancewind is kind of there in a variety of different stories. Yeah, that's what you can do when you have a series that's long enough, and it's wonderful. You can, as a reader, the world gets very comfortable for you. And as a writer, that's great, because then you can throw all sorts of new stuff into the mix.
If you love your world, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Speaking of reading, my second question would be, what are you reading right now? What's on your Kindle? What's on your night table?
Mostly I'm reading magazines now, science fiction magazines, because I'm trying to get a handle on short stories. I know what I like. I'm trying to see what's out there. Mostly, I have to admit, so far, and I won't name the magazines just so that nobody gets the wrong idea, but mostly so far, the stories that I've read are not stories that I want in my magazine. So there's kind of a negative example thing happening where I'm learning kind of what I don't want. I'm not worried. We haven't actually opened submissions to the general public yet, but when we do, I expect we're going to have a deluge. And I don't think there's going to be any difficulty finding stories that are going to create the kind of magazine that I want.
Yeah.
But so yeah.
Yeah, short story magazines. Any particular that you really enjoy? Not to, we're not going to talk about the ones that you're not enjoying, but which ones did you? Which ones are you enjoying the most?
Well, was it either the latest issue of Asimov's or Analog? I'm trying to remember which one it was. It has an excerpt from a novel by a guy I actually know, Derek Kunskin. He runs CanCon, the science fiction convention in Ottawa, which is one of the most fun conventions, and I always try and get up there if I can. And his novel his novel excerpt was really a lot of fun. I can't wait, maybe next time I'm in Ottawa, to pick up a copy of the novel. So that was good. I would definitely recommend that. And that issue actually had 2 or 3 stories that were fun. As you might expect, as a humor writer, fun is a very important quality to me. And I have talked to a lot of different science fiction writers over the years, and one of the things that we kind of lament is the whole dystopian movement, and science fiction is so dark sometimes and can be such a drag. And so if I can help, inject more fun into the genre, that alone would be worthwhile, I think.
It's interesting. So my last question is, where can we find you on the World Wide Web? And I think we've kind of handled that in bits and pieces, but maybe just where's your website and Twitter and Facebook, stuff like that?
Sure. I'll probably email you all that stuff just because it's easier for people to see in print rather than actually try and follow. But yes, my website is Les Pages aux Folles. It is LESPAGESAUX FOLLES.ca. All that other stuff. People can find me on Twitter. People can find me on Facebook. People should look up Elsewhen Press. Elsewhen Press is a small British press that punches way above its weight. It has such a great catalog of great books. There's just so much there that I defy anybody to go to their website and not find something that they will like. And of course, yes, amazing stories people should check out. I was a book reviewer there for a year and a half. I was the managing editor of the website for a year and a half after that. People can, if they want to get a sense of kind of where I'm coming from, they can read my book reviews, and that would give them something to go on anyway. And there's a lot of interesting stuff and amazing stories, just generally. And absolutely, the Kickstarter, any and all support is always welcome.
And I found that just by searching for amazing stories, so it's quite easy to find on Kickstarter.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I again thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I thank you so much for being willing to come on and talk to me.
Oh, my pleasure. I seem to have inherited. I told I mentioned earlier that my dad seems to be this amazing storyteller. He seems to love telling his stories. He's always looking for people he hasn't met before so that he can tell the same old stories. And it turns out, yeah, I kind of like it too. Who knew, right?
Well,
so thank you for having
me. The writer likes to tell stories. No problem.
Well, not all writers, and you may have come across this, not all writers are good speakers, right? Just because you can put it down in print doesn't mean you can be a good oral storyteller.
I will flop all over my tongue trying to tell a story orally without it being right in front of me on paper. I'm horrible at it. I am really, really bad at telling people a story.
It's a different skill.
It really is.
The only sort of thing that I might say in regard with that is that I'm before I was a print geek, I was a script geek. When I was an undergrad, I took 3 years of screenwriting, and I spent about a decade working on screenplays. And of course, I did a lot of research on interactive storytelling. I'm not, as a lot of writers can sometimes be, I'm not focused on a specific medium. So I've also done a lot of radio, actually, which may help this directly. But so the point is, I tell stories in so many different media that oral media is just one more, right?